Okay. Well, you're welcome once again to Book Chat. But this time around, we have with us Professor Wale Adebanwi. To be candid with you, I really do not need to read this bio. Those of you who have been conversant with Nigerian media, who have been conversant with Tribune, and who have been conversant with the number of books he's written would just know him. But just for the benefit, just perchance that there is somebody here who is not conversant or who is not aware of Professor Wale Adebanwi, he's a Guggenheim Fellow, is the Presidential Penn Compact Professor of African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and holds a secondary appointment in the Department of Political Science. Before joining University of Pennsylvania, he was at various times an assistant professor, associate professor, and full professor at the University of Ibadan, the Nigeria premier university. And they also say that it's UI and other universities. Well, that's for another story. He's also been at the University of California, Davis, USA, and the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. At the University of Oxford, he was the Rhodes Professor of Race Relations, Director of African Studies Center from 2017 to 2020, and the Governing Board Fellow at St. Anthony's College from 2017 to 2021. He was a visiting professor at Rhodes University, Grahamstown, South Africa, and currently a senior research associate at the African Studies Center, University of Oxford. Professor Adebanwi has received fellowships and research grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the African American Institute. His research and teaching are in social mobilization of power and interest in Africa as manifested in and or through ethnicity, nationalism, racial and urban formations, elites, state and civil society, media, intellectual history, and social theory. His research focuses primarily on Nigeria and South Africa. He co-edited the Journal of Contemporary African African Studies. Well, and also Africa, Journal of International Africa Institute. I told you from the beginning that we have a wonderful guest today, but our interest with him is a book he's just released. And like we always want to find out, what is the story behind this book? You know, there are everybody who writes a book, there's always an interesting story how the book was written. Some people will even tell you that if they didn't write this particular book, they would not have rested at all. But let's find out from Professor Wale Adebanwi, why this book? Why now?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So the book, How to Become a Big Man in Africa, Subalternity, Elites, and Ethnic Politics in Contemporary Nigeria, was published last year, August. But it's a book that was in the making for more than 2 decades. I started writing it during COVID. I should say that actually the COVID era made it possible for me to write this book because I have been carrying around the materials, through 3 continents over 2 decades, from Nigeria to California in the United States to Oxford in the UK and back here, eventually in Philadelphia. So in just before maybe it's also important to mention that I have a background in journalism. So as a journalist in Nigeria, I was of course interested and engaged one way or the other with the pro-democracy struggle in Nigeria. So towards the end of this struggle, um, the the organization that I studied, the Odua People's Congress, emerged, and so I was interested, in this group as a reporter, and eventually as a student of society. So Around 1998, 99 was when I actually started, collecting data on the group, even though I've been interested in it earlier, since its formation. So eventually, I became even more interested in the faction of the group that is called the Ghanaian Dance faction or the militant faction. So, but initially, of course, I started with the group. Then, when there was a break in the ranks of the leadership, I continued to study the group. But a major turning point was when I received the um, Social Science Research Council of New York, the research grant, which was on youth in the study of youth in Africa, and there were about 12 of us who were given this grant to study different youth movements in the continent. So this was a turning point in the research, and after the conclusion of that fellowship, I continued to study the group and to pay attention to the group, and eventually my interest, zero, was now focusing on the Ghanaian dance faction. And eventually, I became even more interested in Adam's own transformation itself. This is where the idea of how to become a big man emerged from. So it's a study of a movement, and I was using the movement to study the question of violence and ethnic politics in Nigeria. And eventually, that blossomed to a general study of the Nigerian formation through this group and eventually through the phenomenon of Ghanaian dams and its rise and its transformation.
Well, straight to my own question. Your book interrogates the figure of the big man, in quote, within Nigeria's socio-political landscape. How does your conceptualization complicate or extend existing theoretical frameworks on African political elites and clientelism?
Thank you very much. So I was interested in, as I said, when this study began, I wasn't looking at a big man because there was no big man in the context in which that emerged in the study. So it was, I think, around the 10th year or the 11th year of this study that it struck me that what I am actually witnessing is the transformation of a subaltern into a member of the elite. And I thought this was a very fascinating, transformation because I was looking at the group initially in the context of violence and ethnic politics. Then I then found that this whole template became, in a sense, a backdrop for the self actualization of a particular subject in history, a particular agent, that's Ghanaian. And so, and the way in which it was being transformed by circumstances and it was deliberately also transforming himself became very interesting for me. And I saw patterns that reminded me of the literature that I was familiar with as a student of anthropology about the big man in, particularly from Marshall Salin's study. Uh, and it just struck me that maybe I might be witnessing something in this context that is very interesting, especially looking at it again in the context of the way in which the concept of big man has been used, particularly in Africanist political science. So, as someone who's trained in political science and anthropology, I thought I was, uniquely placed to be able to see how useful this concept is in the way it was used in the past in anthropology and continues to be used, and the way in which political scientists have used it in Africa. So, whereas in classical, what we might call classical anthropological study, it is study of a man who, through his own effort, is able to transform himself and to become somebody of eminence in his society.
Hmm.
Whereas in Africanist political science, is about almost always a political leader who, through corruption, is able to amass a lot of wealth, is able to amass, is able to gain, a position in society and to dominate society. And I thought there is a way in which the Africanist political science seem to have subverted the original formulation of big man in anthropological studies. And I wanted to rehabilitate this concept to be able to understand someone who is not a political leader, who is not your typical, you know, big man in both Africanist political science and, of course, the reporting of Africa in the international media. And I thought, okay, this is how to understand this phenomenon in the context of Africa without necessarily, you know, using all the negative stereotypes. I
mm,
mean, the stereotypes that are the central to the understanding of the big man in Africanist political science. And so, my basic argument is that to be able to understand the ways in which young men, and could be young women too, and there are young women also in OPC, who come from a position of disadvantage can leverage that position of disadvantage through different means, violence, in this case, ethnicity, ethnic identity, also the identity as young people, structural adjustment and economic inequality, and all of that to mobilize that and use that as springboard to make themselves into a subject of history. And then through that process, amass all sorts of resources, including material resources, including, prestige, and then become a big man. And I think Gani Adam is a fascinating example. And as I might get to this as we go along, I have in the last chapter of the book, I then try to make a comparison between him and Julius Malema in South Africa, who
mm,
has almost a similar trajectory with some differences, and to make an argument that perhaps this is a very, very useful way to understand the phenomenon of young people who come from a lot of deprivation and are able to mobilize the resources in their society to transform themselves into a position of not just eminence, but preeminence.
mm. Well, as you mentioned Julius Malema, my mind just went to his coinage of contractpreneur. But before I get distracted by juju, as it's called, um, I know that Spivak has asked, can the subaltern speak? And in examining the interplay between subalternity and elite formation, how do you theorize the agency of marginalized groups within systems that seem structurally skewed towards elite reproduction? I think you've given a hint to that, but
This,
how
this
in
is
other
at the
words?
heart of the argument I'm making, and that's a fascinating question. I actually took on Spivak to say the assumption that the subaltern cannot speak, is actually, in this context, you can see the limitation of that assumption.
Mm,
So, first, in their own sense of things, because I'm looking both, from the angle of the ways in which these agents, Gani Adams and other members of OPC, articulate their own understanding of their role in society, and of course, my own interpretation of that articulation. So, they do not see themselves as people who are incapable of speaking. They
mm,
started out by speaking through a very, very strong, even if you like, you could say violent language around pro-democracy, rule. I mean, pro-democracy movement. Then that transformed into, the language of ethno-nationalism, because, as they argue, they reached a point in which they identified a certain ethnic formation in Nigeria, and in their understanding, the implication of the interest of that ethnic formation with military rule as the critical challenge that they faced. So, and they decided that they were going to fight on the basis of this understanding. Now, some of this manifested through violence, and eventually that transformed into all sorts of things. Vigilante, at a point, OPC was involved in a lot of, and of course, they became the vanguard of our nationalist movement. So basically, I'm using this to illustrate that the supporters actually can speak. And they can define the way in which they speak, but they do not speak in isolation. As you can see, from the ways in which I try to approach this phenomenon, you can see in many contexts the ways in which existing elites would use these agents and these subjects, use their group, and the ways in which they also use this elite. So, because they are also involved in the process of transformation, and the elite of the existing elite understood the power of the number of the membership of this group, and of course their capacity for actual and potential violence, especially during electoral politics. And so these guys recognized that this elite wanted to use them, and they were ready to also use this elite. So part of what I'm trying to argue is that to assume that the subaltern cannot speak or act for themselves is wrong, even though that action and that speech uh, would be imbricated in existing forms of social organization and social hierarchy. But they
mm,
have the capacity to disrupt that hierarchy. And Gani Adams is a fascinating example of someone starting from that, level. And I was, you know, privy to all sorts of ways by which members of the elite described him, dismissed him over time, and eventually became one of them. That, as I show in the book, that he would come into a gathering and he was then a former governor, but the current president will have to stand to shake his hand. If you see in that book, I have about 200 images. You will see at some point when he came into a gathering, he bowed to greet, the former governor while the former governor was sitting. At another point in the book, you'll see that when they came in, the former governor and the governor in the north stood up to greet him. So that's a way in which you show the disruption that the subaltern are capable of actually, introducing into the whole mix of social elevation, social hierarchy in contemporary society.
Well, I want to take you back to 2005, almost 20 years ago, when you chose that very interesting title for your article, The Carpenters Revolt, Youth, Violence, and Reinvention of Culture in Nigeria. And to those who are not familiar with uh, Jerry Adams and Gani Adams and how a carpenter, as it were, became a big man. What was behind your mind when you set out in 2005 to write The Carpenter's Revolt?
Thank you so much. So that was the first piece that I published in this long line, of inquiry into this group. So as I mentioned, that research was initially funded by the Social Science Research Council. And so the report that I submitted so I wrote that piece from the report that I submitted from the research. So it just struck me along the lines of doing that research, and I would extend how that relates to the larger project, that in the context in which this guy emerged, the Yoruba context. So there in the late 19th century, and there have been fascinating, analysis of this by my former supervisor, Professor, John Peel, who is late now, and other, eminent Yoruba scholars, about the ways in which the Yorubas embraced the Enlightenment. And Professor Olufemi Taiwo has a fascinating book on this, how colonialism preempted modernity in Africa. And the core argument is that it was actually missionary Christianity that brought the Enlightenment to parts of Africa, not colonialism. That colonialism itself was a subversion of the Enlightenment project. So the point I wanted to make with that is that so the Yorubas embraced the Enlightenment project, and a very fascinating story. Now, so in the transformation that happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century, so the way in which you become somebody of consequence, someone of consequence in Yoruba land was you have education.
Hmm.
So you become somebody of consequence. Before then, and I try to analyze this in the paper, the Carpenter's Revolt, there was a tradition of war boys, Omogun. So you became somebody of consequence through physical prowess, through displaying bravery and all of that in war. So Canadian becomes a very interesting subject in that trajectory. So because he dropped out of school in the third year, which is also significant because this was when the Unity Party of Nigeria, the party that was popular in this area of the country, the military took over power, so the free education project ended. So he dropped out of school. Now, so is by the way in which the modern Yoruba identity is constituted, he would not be somebody of consequence because he
Hmm.
didn't go to school. So you can see how he then appropriate that older the older values and virtues of Omogun war boys to impose himself in the context of modern electoral politics and also ethno-regional politics. So
Hmm.
by using that old, valued, idea and ideal of valor of bravery in Yoruba history and marrying it with the contemporary challenges of what it means to be a person of consequence and facing the challenges because he knew people were disregarding him because he didn't go to school. So he knew that he needed to do something about that, which is why he eventually went back to school, got a diploma, got a degree, got an honorary doctorate. So these are part of the things that I'm trying to see. So what does it mean to be a person of consequence in Yoruba land? So he challenges that, and maybe we'll get to talk about it. His, selection and eventual installation as Are Ona Kakanfo then becomes a very, very interesting way to analyze this trajectory that I just mentioned. And
Mm.
I use that also to contest some of the people who are like, how could somebody like this be appointed Are Ona Kakanfo following MK Abiola and before him SL Akitola, and that this is an aberration? I try to analyze in the book. Actually, it was people like him who used to be Are Ona Kakanfo before SL Akitola. So SL Akitola and Abiola were the aberrations. So they were the aberrations. He is the kind of person who will be Are Ona Kakanfo in Yoruba history.
A friend of mine once said that one of the Arero Noka was a thug. And I think that you're giving some kind of validation to what he just said casually. But
But you see, this is part of the challenge is that people need to understand in studying figures like this. What does it mean to be a thug?
mm,
In the language of this person that you mentioned, yes, he could look back and say people like that were thugs, but they were not regarded. They were men of valor who were really respected in that era. Do you
mm,
see what I mean? So,
yes.
and of course, this is also one of the accusations against Ghanaian Adams in contemporary time. People will dismiss him, in many ways, area boy, thug, and all of that. But you can see through this accounting how all of that came from a particular context in Yoruba, modern history. You are not a person of consequence if you don't have education.
Mm.
So you can see how he contests those understandings and was able to disrupt it eventually and force his way into the innermost circles of the super elite, not just in Yoruba land, but in Nigeria.
When you also talked about Professor Peel, you brought back memories of the piece he wrote on Olaju,
Yeah.
about the bifurcation of development as Ilosiwaju
Mhm.
and Idagbasoke. So
Yeah.
it just, from everything you've said, it just gives it some more flesh to
Yeah.
understand what late uh, Professor Peel was saying.
JDYP. Yeah.
Yes, it's quite an article I return to yearly because for me it captures an essence of understanding this whole question of development. But before I get distracted, let me move on to um, I would like to understand to what extent is ethnicity functioning as a mobilizing tool versus a constitutive element of elite identity in Nigerian politics, particularly in the post-colonial context.
Yes, and I think this one of the things I try to do with this book is to show how people, agents within society, subjects in history, mobilize different kinds of resources to
Mm.
ensure personal transformation,
Mhm.
personal glory. So in this case, you can see the role of ethnic identity and ethno-nationalism in the mobilization. Now, one of the things, and I made this argument, I do not assume that these agents, these subjects, are starting from a position of absolute selfishness.
Mm.
But I am trying to account for the complexity of human life, which includes personal ambition, selfishness, you know, valor, you know, collective, interest, uh, mobilization for social group. So all of these things can become so mixed up that it is different. It is very difficult to tease out where does ambition start and collective, public interest, end. I mean start. So none of these people. I'm not presenting any of these people as a saint or as a sinner, but I'm
Mm.
trying to account for the reality of social life in contemporary Nigeria. So in this case, you can see how ethnic identity, ethno-nationalism, are mobilized in different ways by people who have ambition, either to become person of consequence socially, economically, or politically. And you can see how different politicians, one of the most interesting chapters for me in the book is the chapter where I look at how, Ghanaian the elites, four particular examples, two former presidents, or one case, he was president at the point that that I was doing this analysis. So former president Obasanjo, then President Goodluck Jonathan, then two governors, Governor Bola Tinubu, and then Governor Benga Daniel, and how Canada was able to manipulate is the different kinds of dynamics involved in this relation with these four people who ordinarily would take it for granted that this is in their language a boy that they could use, and he ended up using all of them in different ways. So this is part of, so I'm trying to account for how people can leverage ethnic identity, and this is what members of elite do in different parts of the continent. And the Nigerian example is very fascinating for me, and I try to show in different ways through the lens of a particular young man who grew into not just an older person, but you know who in fact is regarded as an elder
Mm.
because of what he has accomplished and the ways in which this elder, now relates to those who would ordinarily have been his elder, culturally speaking. I'm basically trying to account for the means and you know the ways in which the elite mobilize their ethnic identity in their own search for power, prominence, and leverage within society.
You give a very good lens for anybody who wants to read The Path to Power of Julius Malema and Zuma of South Africa. How, as the president of the youth wing, Zuma got there, and when it was time for Julius Malema, it's quite an interesting
It, it,
lens.
it's interesting that you say that because that's what I'm actually working on now. I ended the book by hinting at the comparison between Malema and Gani Adams, and then between Adams and the warlords in the Niger Delta.
This.
Different examples of how young people use the identity of youth, the ethnic, or in the case of Malema, racial identity, you know, as ways of leveraging themselves into the center of socioeconomic and political lives.
Well, I know that time is not our friend, but I would beat myself if I don't ask you, how do you situate the big man figure within transnational or comparative context? Are there resonances with elite formation in other post-colonial or post-authoritarian societies, or is it the Nigerian case uniquely configured?
No, there's nothing unique about Nigeria. In fact, it's so interesting that a colleague last month told me that when she saw my book and read just a little part of it, she works in Eastern Europe, and she was so struck by the ways in which she could identify some figures in the societies that she studied, she studies, that are almost equivalents of the case that I am studying. So there's nothing unique. You could say that it's a it in contemporary times, it's a phenomenon that would be easily identifiable within what you might call developing nations. But you could also find so-called developed nations, you know, some rogue nations, which are developed. I would spare the mention of their names, where you have similar social configuration, where
Mhm.
elements like these can rise. So, but in Africa, in fact, we had a panel last year at the African Studies Association conference. No, actually, at the American Anthropological Association, where we had about 5, 6 colleagues who presented about similar figures from different parts of the continent. One from DRC, one from Cameroon, I think one from Mozambique. So it's nothing, there is nothing unique, in this in Nigeria. But this in the different societies, and that's why I'm interested in comparative studies of this kind of phenomenon in different parts of Africa and other parts of the global south. Uh, there are different, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the Nigerian context, you see that the strongest identity is the ethno-regional identity, the ethnic identity. In the case of South Africa, when you move to South Africa with Malema, you see there is racial identity. So there are all sorts of different configurations, but the elements, that are similar in all of this is the way in which a particular subject in history would mobilize these different challenges of society through their agency as a young person to intervene in social process, and by so doing become people of eminence, like all these people become, really economically powerful, with a lot of, resources, and of course with a lot of leverage, either in politics directly or indirectly.
Well, you're still on to book chat with Professor Wale Adebanwi. And what I want him to do now is to reach into his bag and bring out his crystal ball. Because looking ahead, do you see any emerging political figures or movements that challenge or complicate the big man model of leadership in Nigeria?
I wish so. We have a long way to go. The reality of the socioeconomic and political dynamics in Nigeria and elsewhere in the continent is such that would, for some time to come, have this kind of phenomenon. And I do not mean big man in the way in which Africanist political science, has the typical corrupt, clientelist, patrimonial figures. I think, and that's one of the arguments I make in the book. I think this analysis as Rich is called sack. I mean, it's no longer very useful in understanding, a very complex interplay of social forces and cultural, economic, and political dynamics that do not lend themselves to this easy, what what I see now as easy, pathways for understanding what's going on in the continent. And that's why I think also the challenge for us as students of society is to really be engaged in understanding what's going on. We don't sit in our ivory towers as, some of these analysts do, and just pronounce on what's going on because of what they are able to see only, by what they see, without fully engaging with what's going on behind
Mm,
the scene. And so, what I do in this book is to get behind the scene, to
mm,
really understand what's going on with people so that you can account for the social reality. And in the context of that understanding, and I've had the privilege of being able to have some access, because partly because of my background in journalism, to fully account for what's going on. I remember a colleague and I, when we joined political science department in Ibadan, coming from journalism, and we were also students of political science studying, for a PhD in political science. And we will hear some of our senior colleagues talk about what's going on in society, and we'll just laugh that, these professors do not know what's going on in the country, So, and I think part of the so that's one, privilege I've had. The other, of course, is, to study anthropology, and to have the privilege of, understanding, ethnographic, study, which you are out there, you are with the people who are doing things, So, in the context of, you are there with, sometimes I'm there with politicians, in their living room, where they're saying things that they will not say in public, where they're
mm,
engaging in ways that, people will not know the people will not know what they're actually saying or doing in. So you have the privilege of being able to account for the background to what you see in public. And I think this is a very useful way to understand what's going on. And on the basis of that understanding, I think this phenomenon, the kind of big man that I'm, are dealing with here, not the one that, you know, um, uh, scholars dismiss, as, you know, big man, African big man. This kind of understanding of this kind of phenomenon, I think, helps us to account for what's going on in society and why, in many ways our society remain, the way they are, and would remain so for quite a while.
Well, there's something we do around here, which is called their names. And just, I know that Gani Adams is the main focus of his book, but the other faction of OPC that was led by Dr.
Frederick Fashion.
Drell, I just wanted a mention of the name Frederick Fashion,
Yes.
as so that it doesn't just, this story cannot be told without a little bit of Dr. Frederick Fashion and all he did, and to those of us who are outside, and how he probably was betrayed. But I just felt that his name should at least be mentioned.
Oh,
What would
absolutely.
you?
There's a lot about Dr. Fashion in the book. I mean, you can't talk about OPC without talking about the founding president. And I provide, you know, details of what happened between them from the two sides because I was also, as told you, when I started, I used to go to meetings of the Fashion faction. I spoke with Dr. Fashion, a few times. I spoke with those who are in his faction. By the way, as you probably are aware, if you read the book, you'll see that there are about five, six factions of OPC now. So every single faction I engage with them over 2 decades. So I know the story. So you can find the account of every side in that story and my analysis of what I think happened that led to the fractionalization. So absolutely, thank you for mentioning Dr. Fashion, the late Dr. Fashion's name. Yeah, we can't talk about OPC without talking about him.
Well, like Professor Biodun Jefo will say, and finally, if anybody who's engaged him, and I trust me, this is finally. A book like this from somebody in the academy. How do you see this book being used in North America or used in Africa? Because I know that you're very heavy on the ethnographic methodology. But apart from that, in what areas do you see that this book of yours can be plugged in within the curriculum, within the syllabus in North America, and then maybe in Africa? And I think you mentioned somebody from East is it Latin America who's done some work? How do you see this book in terms of the structure of the academy that you think it will be useful?
Okay, well, first, let me say that I have been making a lot of effort. I've not succeeded yet to get a Nigerian edition published, which will be cheaper and more affordable in the continent. I mean, the shame of it is that sometimes, well, most times we publish all these books in the north, and we people back home are not able to access it. If I have my way, I would, I've loved it to be open access. But but what we're doing now is to try and find a Nigerian publisher. A publisher was interested, but seemed uninterested, now. But so anyway, so that is as to how the book will be. Uh, uh, how the book will be used or how people would approach the book, that's out of my hand. What I was capable of doing is to lend, my effort to the understanding of a particular social phenomenon and to try to do a comparative analysis of how this phenomenon is also important for understanding what's going on elsewhere. And I gave the example of South Africa. And I'm hoping, as I concluded the book, I hoping that others will take on this task of understanding this, and it's very, I think it's also critical because, everybody talks about the youth bulge in Africa. I mean, Africa is the most useful continent in the world.
Mm,
So, and when you look at, as this case illustrates, the enormous challenges faced by young people. And as those of us who are interested in youth studies who always say that young people are going to do something.
mhm,
So you better ensure that they do good things. And they have a lot of energy and capacity and absolute, almost an absolute capacity for risk. Young people do not believe that they will die, so they can do anything. So you've got to provide for them the opportunities to be able to do socially, useful things. So it's important, therefore, to understand the challenges faced by young people and the different ways by which they respond to this. And there's fascinating literature that is emerging in understanding the challenges of young people in Africa. So for me, this is a token contribution to that understanding within the context of the larger socioeconomic and political dynamics in the continent.
So you see a book like this in the discipline of anthropology, in political science,
In
and you've
sociology,
mentioned youth studies.
in
I'm not sure
sociology,
in what of the departments youth studies will be located. I know that there's women, youth, and children department, and I'm not sure um, books like this feature there, but
yeah,
I don't know. I'm just like saying in in the way North America works, in the way the
yeah,
universities work here.
and cultural studies too.
Uh,
Yeah, you see a lot, about songs, about, the dancing, the cultural events, beauty pageantry, all sorts of things, ways by which people, this subject is trying, to create social status and social, different means of, articulating and mobilizing, social value. So I think there are different ways by which different people from different disciplines would approach the book, but that's out of my hands.
Will, we can make suggestions and also whet the appetite to want to pick a copy of the book. Well, Professor Wale Adebanwi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to
Thank you.
us on Book Chat. And
Thank you.
that's the way it's going to be until another time when we bring to you another great mind. We're saying thank you very much and
Thank you.
please get a copy of the book. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.